and welcome to another episode of This Week in Cleantech, a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less. Today is Friday, January 17th, 2025. I'm Renewable Energy World Editor-in-Chief John Engel. Brendan Koerner from Wired Magazine is going to join us shortly, but for now I'm joined by Cleantech commentator Mike Casey of Tigercom, who is hopefully much healthier than I am right now. Mike, it's good to see you.
John, you are playing hurt here, and I want to acknowledge that. Thank you for doing this. I also want to say thanks to Chuck Ray. He's Director of Fleet Solutions at Microgrid Labs. He said he's a listener. And John, we had agreed that you would get sick a little bit closer to Harold Hamm's fossil fuel inaugural ball because you're going to take my ticket and go in and sneeze on the doorknobs. But you got sick a little too early. So, I don't know. We're going to have to figure something out, my friend.
Oh, well, back to the drawing board. Okay, we want to thank our listeners who have told us what they think of these shows and sent in those story recommendations. You can do so by emailing rew@clarionevents.com. All right, Mike.
First story, Elizabeth Colbert of The New Yorker. She writes a piece called The Insurance Crisis that will follow the California fires. John.
Yeah, just one of the many tangential stories that's going to come out of the devastating fires around Los Angeles. So California's insurance market is unstable, and a major cause is the significant damage caused by wildfires. In 2023, Allstate and State Farm announced they would stop writing new policies for several forms of property insurance in the state in response to inflation and, quote, rapidly growing catastrophe exposure. The insurers are finding California riskier due to the combination of people moving into fire-prone areas and fires becoming more destructive, partly because of climate change. Until some recent rules were revised, California's insurance regulations hindered insurance companies from accurately forecasting the trend of increasing wildfire losses and passing on the cost of reinsurance. New rule revisions change that, but also require insurers to write more policies for homeowners in wildfire-prone areas. Mike, I'll kick it over to you, but I'll also flag that this is not just a California issue. We have insurers leaving North Carolina, and that was far before a hurricane devastated Asheville. So this is a widespread challenge.
John, I've got good news. We can be relieved to know that the global climate disruption crisis agreed on by 97% of the world's climatologists has magically disappeared. The incoming energy secretary, fracker Chris Wright, is proving the power of both magical thinking and the prevalence of recreational psychedelics in his home state of Colorado by saying there is no climate crisis. Good news. Back in the real world, however, California homeowners are unable to secure fire insurance. They find the state's FAIR plan is the insurer of last resort. It provides coverage through a shared risk system among private insurers, but rising property values and mounting wildfire damages threaten the plan's stability. The plan currently has $377 million with an M available to cover claims that could reach into the billions with a B. As you might notice, the math just doesn't add up. If the FAIR plan goes broke, the state's insurance companies will have to make up the difference, passing on cost to consumers via much higher rates. If Californians, on the other hand, have to cover the cost overruns, the FAIR plan is effectively subsidizing suburban sprawl into climate disaster-prone areas. With the escalating impacts of climate disruption, continuing this approach is not the best way to adapt. John, number 2.
All right, this one's from Ivan Penn, New York Times, titled Los Angeles Utilities Decision to Keep Power On Scrutinized. Mike.
While the cause of the LA wildfires is still unclear, experts believe the power lines could have started them and should have been shut off in the dry, windy conditions. To make matters worse, the LA Department of Water and Power, the nation's largest municipal utility, does not have a plan to preemptively shut off power in urban areas during the times of elevated fire risk. The department argues that shutting off power during high winds could disrupt vital services, yet it blocks circuits from automatically restoring power after outages in the same exact conditions. Plus, the poles and the conductors on the utility's electric grid were designed for wind speeds of 56 miles an hour, but wind speeds basically doubled that last week. John.
Yeah, we've seen the growth of PSPS programs, as they're called, especially out west. I'm curious what the municipal utility aspect of this, how that impacts the PSPS and different technology investments, because Los Angeles, LADWP is different than the state's 3 investor-owned utilities. They operate differently. They're regulated by a city council. They don't answer to investors. So I think there are a lot of different things to consider here, and we will have that time. We saw it with PG&E, that there will be an exhaustive process to go through the litigation and go through the regulatory reprimand and all that kind of stuff. I am hesitant to jump to any kind of conclusion about what caused these fires, who was at fault, until a lot of this shakes out. And I think that pause is warranted. Get through the disaster and figure out, where we go from there. That's my position, and that'll be the position of my reporting as well. Mike, our third story.
Maxine Joslow, a This Week in Cleantech veteran guest. She's with the Washington Post, and she writes a piece called "This Group Says Natural Gas Bans Hurt Minorities, but It Has Gas Industry Ties." I am shocked there's gambling in Casablanca, John. Don't know about you.
All right, so Maryland state lawmakers proposed a bill last year to ban the use of natural gas furnaces and water heaters in new buildings statewide. Ex-NFL player Gary Baxter claimed the bill would raise energy costs for Black households. What Baxter didn't mention is that the group he leads, the Energy Poverty Awareness Center, or NPAC, has ties to the Consumer Energy Alliance, which works to, quote, expose attacks on renewable energy and counter misinformation by fossil fuel and utility interests, end quote. The Consumers Energy Alliance, quote, helped launch NPAC and shape its initial agenda. The connection between energy companies and advocacy groups dates back to 2005, when Exxon donated over $800,000 to the National Black Chamber of Commerce, which opposed President Obama's Clean Power Plan, claiming it would hurt minorities by slowing job growth. The vice president of NPAC is also an official at a trade group for oil refiners. Mike, I think a lot of trade groups might be guilty of what we are calling out in this story, but give your take.
That's my take. So the industry that brought us the FP&L Matrix scandal, the $61 million first energy corruption scandal, now presents us with this delightful trip into legalized corruption and organized deception. So not to interrupt the frackers' propaganda exercise with reality, but here are some inconvenient facts. Heat pumps are also 3 times more energy efficient than gas furnaces. That means big savings on energy bills for households. And research shows that African Americans are statistically more likely to live in older, less energy efficient homes and face higher energy burdens. They are the ones who stand to benefit most from these technologies. John, I know we normally don't self-promote here, but I did want to cover this next renewable energy world story, which I recommended over your strenuous objections, I might add.
I would not object to our own reporting, but our fourth story by my colleague Paul Gerke is Rex Silicon pulls the plug on polysilicon production at Moses Lake plant. This is a really interesting one, Mike. What were your takeaways?
My takeaways, well, first, I got to admit, Gerke paid me some money to recommend his story on the show. So let's just get that out. Full disclosure, it was not a lot, but just a couple of $1,000 goes a long way. Okay. On Monday, REC Silicon announced it will stop polysilicon production at its Moses Lake plant in Washington state. The decision comes after the company received news from its customer, Hanwha Q-Cells, that it had failed another purity test. REC Silicon also ceased production at its Butte, Montana site in February 2024. The company claimed impurities on post-reactor product finishing and handling issues, but despite delays and efforts to fix the problem, it failed the qualification test in December of 2024. John?
Well, another interesting element here is I believe Hanwha Q-Cells is the largest shareholder of REC Silicon or Rex Silicon, or I've never actually heard it spoken out loud, so I've only read it, and now I'm being put to the test. But unfortunately, there are no other customers for Rex polysilicon in the U.S. right now, and limited customers outside of China. So they have no one to produce for. The company aims to return to profitability, but this blow to an already meager domestic polysilicon market, the solar supply chain is more vulnerable to price fluctuations and geopolitical tensions, especially with the president-elect threatening tariffs on Chinese imports. It really calls into question this pursuit of a fully domestic solar supply chain that we heard a whole lot about over the last 2 years, and the chief proponent of that effort, Hanwha Q-Cells. So we'll see where we go from here. Mike, our last story and our guest this week.
Brendan Koerner of Wired Magazine, welcome. He writes a piece, The Spectacular Burnout of a Solar Panel Salesman. Like this story, Brendan. If people haven't read it, which we want them to, what's the big takeaway?
I just wanted to understand the lived experience of those young men who go knocking on doors, trying to sell solar panel systems to people. I think any of us who live in homes have had this happen to us probably multiple times. A pack of young men in like crisp polos and khaki shorts come and try to sweet talk you into, investing $25,000 in a solar system. And I was wondering, who are these young men? How do they get involved in this, and what are their lives like?
You'd be interested to know that John Engel was one of their victims, so which he was willing to share on this show.
Mhm.
Yeah, I did talk a lot about that. And that was right around the time that Time put out a really interesting report, too, about the quote unquote solar bros. So I liked seeing your kind of investigation into this space and hope you can square it with that reputation of like, so then tell us, who are these people? Because you're right. I see them all the time. I'm in a new build house, so I have direct sunlight. They love our house. They come here all the time. I'm assuming they're using Aurora software to tell me about, how amazing my sun potential is. And they get on their hoverboard and then they wisp away. So what did you find out? Who are these guys?
These companies are really tapping into this kind of culture among young men who are really into things like fitness and self-improvement and looking up to entrepreneurs, looking up to influencers who talk about ways to make money, talk about sales, the power of sales, sales techniques, and are more and more disenchanted with colleges and universities and don't want to go into debt to get degrees. They have uncertain applications later in their lives. These are people who make really good recruits for these door-to-door enterprises. The problem being that once they actually get out in the field, very few of them are able to tough it out for long periods of time. It's an incredibly difficult job. You're knocking on 100, 150 doors a day, getting constantly rejected, yelled at, abused. And then there's not a lot of controls sometimes for these companies with managers who, as I found for the characters in my story, often would sell a system and expect a big commission check and then find out they only made maybe a couple $100 after deductions and maybe some fictional stories were told to them about, how the product was not as profitable as they saw. So it's a very, very difficult way to make money.
Brendan, wait a minute. Young, in looking up to authority figures, into health. That sounds a lot like John Engel, but no, he don't.
Into health.
Okay. All right.
That's where you really lost me. Well, and I'll interject here, Mike, because Mike was alluding to my own story. So I had one of these guys come up to my door, knock on the door, and say he was with the local utility. And I told this story previously on the podcast. And me working in the utility space and energy more broadly, I knew that was not true and started to press him. Ultimately went to the CEO and said, this is deceptive. Is this part of your practices? I'm going to report on this. That company went out of business 2 months later. So I say that because these companies, they start to represent themselves with a national footprint. They set up these little micro shops state by state, and they hit it hard. And if they're not successful, they go bankrupt, they start over, they do something new. Did you get any grasp for what's the industry doing about what is unfortunately many of the public's only connection to clean energy and solar is these kids, really they're kids knocking on the door, maybe not knowing what they're talking about and chasing a dream or money?
So I think it's interesting that a lot of autonomy is given to individual managers who run these crews that travel over the country. And so a lot of your success or failure of your crew depends on your manager. And a lot of times these managers are maybe only like 21, 22, so just barely older than the people that they're in charge of. And they don't really have the competencies to run these enterprises. I also came across one manager who's been remarkably successful working for Freedom Pros and was talking about installing over $3 million worth of systems in 2024. So a lot of it's dependent on these individual managers who have incredible autonomy and maybe don't have a lot of links or relations with the national enterprises.
Well, Brendan, I'm just reminded by Sia's push and Abby Hopper's concern about the damage that some of these folks are doing to solar's reputation nationally. So it'll be interesting how that plays out. But I will say we're just about out of time. John, we need to go to our Cleantecher of the Week.
This week's Cleantecher of the Week is Will Heegaard, CEO of Footprint Project. Footprint Project's Southern California team is bringing mobile solar power and other renewable energy resources to base camps and distribution sites and supporting 92,000 displaced people due to the LA wildfires. They did the same here in North Carolina when we were smacked by Helene. So congratulations to Will and thank you to Footprint for all they do.
We want to thank our wonderful producer, Brian Mendez, and Claire Quirin and Alex Peterson for helping gather these stories.
And thank you to Brendan Koerner for joining this episode of This Week in Cleantech Week. Excuse me for name mispronunciations. I'm off this week, guys. I did my best. I didn't jostle with Mike Casey. I'm here. I squeezed out the last sound from my voice for you, the listener. So we'll catch you next week, and thanks for listening.
You left it all on the microphone, my friend. Good job.
That's right.
All right. Take care.